In October 2020, we made history at the Southmorton Boxing Club by staging the world's first behind-closed-doors white-collar boxing show. We got over 10,000 views on the night across 103 countries. Now we're bringing the live rumble back, bigger and better than before. Follow the fighters in the build-up and vote on the night for your favourites. See all the thrills, spills and skills from the best in white-collar boxing, live and free at the KO Cup.
Okay, Peter, so it's a bit more of a sombre talk I wanted to do today. It's just something that struck me, and it was a tragedy that I wanted to talk about. Nicky Booth, who was British and Commonwealth Super Bantamweight champion. You know, he was a good amateur, started boxing about 15 with his brother Jason. You know, Jason was very good. Nicky was kind of emulating him. Anyway, Nicky was successful in his own right. Like I said, British and Commonwealth champion at 22. You know, his career didn't last that long. He had a tilt at the IBO title and the WBU title. And then, you know, kind of his demons caught up with him, drinking drugs. He died last week at the age of 40. So that in itself is obviously a terrible tragedy, and I'm sure there's manifold reasons around it. But, you know, look at that. I don't want to look at that individual tragedy. I want us to look at more at what that illustrates to us about boxing as a sport in general. And it also got me thinking, because there's been other headlines in the sport this week about Sergey Kovalev. Now, Kovalev, as you know, was a fantastic fighter, or is a fantastic fighter. You know, was undefeated until he had those two reverses against Andre Ward. And since then, you know, he seemed to fall apart a little bit. And, you know, he's just doing this thing. You see it at the end of a fighter's career these days, and you think, here we go again. You know, he's recently been, he's got charges against him of assault with a woman and her dog, trying to kiss a woman on a plane. You know, he's just failed a drugs test. He was, the other day, I know this is not comparable to assaulting someone, but he streamed on his Instagram post the Callum Smith Canelo fight. He streamed the DAZN thing on his Instagram post, which obviously is illegal anyway. He was supposed to be fighting on DAZN the next month. You know, I mean, these are the guys that are feeding you, and it's just bad decisions. That's what I see it as, constant bad decisions, which are going to lead in the end to some sort of tragedy for him. And then I started to think back, and I just recently as well, there's a great documentary on Hector Camacho that's been released. You know, Camacho, again, multiple world champion, incredibly talented guy, you know, had his demons, never really able to get over his street background, shot in his native Puerto Rico in 2012 in some sort of aborted drug deal. You know, nobody was ever brought to justice for it. And then you look back through boxing history, and, you know, you look at Arturo Gatti, you know, more recent things, Edwin Valero, you know, you look at the tragedy that often surrounds and envelops these boxers. And it's not just the top guys. This is the root to the fruit. I mean, I remember particularly in a tragic story, Ernie and Billy Smith, two great journeyman boxers, the backbone of British boxing. I think Billy Smith had like 160 fights. You know, they would fight anywhere, anytime. You give them a ring, they'd just turn up and with their gloves and fight. And they both, you know, very sadly committed suicide. I think it was Ernie in 2010 and Billy in 2013 at the age of around 30, you know, in their early 30s. So, you know, it's a real tragedy. And I think boxing has to look at itself. And there's two questions to answer. The first question, I think, is fairly easy to answer. The second question is really difficult. The first question is this more prevalent in boxing than other sports? Or is this just one of those things? And I think, you know, with some of the examples I've cited, if you just sit down, if you're a boxing fan, and you start to look at the list of tragic endings to lives, you know, you start to think, I don't see this particularly in football, I don't see this particularly in rugby and so on. And I think that is kind of unarguable. Boxing does seem to be plagued by this. The second question is, then why? And this is the really difficult bit. This is something I think boxing needs to address, though. And, you know, the reasons are, you know, every tragedy in a way, like Nicky Booth, is almost explainable away in its own. He did have some good people around him trying to help him, you know, and there maybe is truth to the thing. There's some people you can't help. The demons are just too much, and they eventually succumb if they don't want help. But, you know, I don't want to look at individual tragedies. I want to look at it in the whole. And when you look at the amount of tragedies in boxing, I think there's something here. And, you know, the first thing to look at is people say, well, you know, sometimes a lot of boxers come from the socio-economic boxing background that boxers come from is different to other sports. It's a very working class sport. They tend to be poorer people going into it, who maybe haven't got the background to handle wealth and fame and money. There's maybe some truth to that. You know, I mean, Mike Tyson extensively talked about his background and how he found it impossible to handle money, because in a way his background was, if you get money, you spend it immediately before somebody takes it off you or kills you to get it. So, you know, that obviously led him to a lot of bad decisions, you know. But we do see the socioeconomic background of these people still feeds football. We don't really see this. There's also the argument of just chucking loads of money at young people. Again, that is true, and it does cause some footballers to go off the rails and so on. But it's better controlled, which brings me to another idea about boxing: is that there's a lack of structure in boxing because of the piecemeal nature of the sport. You don't have the support background and the support networks when these people get famous. And as I said, this is from the root to the fruit. But often, when these young guys get famous, they get some money. There's not an organised structure in place for them to be taken care of. Financial advisors to look after them. It does sometimes happen, but they almost have to, be lucky or find the route themselves. So, there's that as well, the lack of structure in boxing, the lack of aftercare in boxing because of that lack of structure is also apparent. I mean, if you look at, for example, at Frank Bruno talked about this extensively when he had his problems after his retirement. Frank Bruno lived quite a regimented existence, which he obviously took to, of go to the gym, train. Somebody told him what to do, when to get up, what to train, how many rounds to box, how many rounds to do on the bag, what to eat, when to go to bed, and so on. And at the end of boxing, that was it. It was like, off you go and find something else to fill your days with. And then we all know about Frank's breakdown and struggles with mental health after that. Another prominent, I don't know, there's no point in me keeping naming these people because, in a way everybody knows it. But, Ricky Hatton has obviously struggled again with that kind of lack of purpose and direction in his life after boxing. Although having said that, Ricky's obviously got his demons and struggle with them, but is still carving out a very successful career. So, I think we've got to look at all these things. And then the other thing that kind of struck me with the Kovalov thing and, the seeming bad decisions that he's making now is something that other sports have looked at and boxing hasn't looked at, and we kind of have to look at. And I think we're a bit scared of looking at it because it threatens the inherent nature of our sport, perhaps. But I think we're better off looking at it ourselves and making decisions and assessments about it than having someone else come in and try and do it. And I'm talking about the blows to the head. American football, going back 10, 15 years, started to see a lot of their ex-players go down this route. In other words, start to make very bad decisions resulting in drug abuse, alcohol abuse, hitting their spouses, just getting arrested, all this sort of thing, early death. And when they were doing the autopsies, they were finding a lot of damage to the frontal lobe. And this is the part of your brain where apparently it controls your risk assessment, controls your decision making. So these guys were getting this brain damage and they assessed it from the tackles, and they changed American football, to still a very entertaining spectacle as a sport. But they did change the sport to try and eradicate this. Now we have rugby looking at the effect of tackles on the brain. We even have football looking at heading the ball and so on. And I know people in boxing will say, look, don't talk about this, it's rubbish, we don't want anything to do with it. But boxing has always risen to the challenge of safety over the years. And it has, we look back at the Michael Watson tragedy and so on, it has managed to get its house in order. And really, because it's so much under the spotlight, people have looked at it and so it has to be medically sound and medically safe. And I think, again, we can do something with this. And we have to look at the fact that it's possible that these blows to the head are adversely affecting decision-making in fighters later in life and maybe leading to some of these tragedies. And there maybe is a way that we can address this and do something about it. But I hate to bring all these questions, Peter, and not bring answers, but it's just something that struck me with the headlines that have come about in boxing in the last few weeks, and then looking back, at all these tragedies, and it's almost it's almost the poetry of the sport. The victory and the defeat and everything else is kind of intertwined sometimes with these tragic lives, and it's part of maybe what keeps us watching. But I think it's something boxing needs to look at. It needs to get its house in order a little bit and say, how can we help these fighters? How can we support these fighters that give us so much and put so much on the line? And, medically, do we need to look more at maybe some of the damages that is being caused in maybe, I don't know, in the gyms, in sparring and so on, and how we can address that. So, not a great, an end of January address, something to think about. Rest in peace, Nicky Booth, but it was really the Nicky Booth tragedy that made me think, that encapsulated something that boxing needs to get its house in order a bit, look at, do a bit of soul searching and maybe take some action. Those were my thoughts.